Hey friends, welcome to a special bonus episode of the Broken to Beloved podcast. If you're looking for compassionate conversations that provide practical resources to move toward healing and wholeness, then this is the place for you. Today, I'm sharing my conversation from the 2024 summit with Geoff and Cyd Holsclaw about attachment theory and how it affects our relationships with ourselves, God, and others. Geoff is an author of multiple books, affiliate professor of theology at Northern Seminary. Cyd is an author, spiritual director, and pastor. She is also trauma-informed, Jesus-centered, integrative coach focused on embodied practices and building a secure attachment to God. Together, they co-host the Attaching to God podcast, offering a neuroscience-informed spiritual formation, and are the co-authors of Does God Really Like Me? Discovering the God Who Wants to Be With You. And now, here's my conversation with our friends, Geoff and Cyd. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our session on quieting an anxious and avoidant faith. I'm here with Geoffrey and Cyd Holsclaw. Geoff is an author of multiple books, affiliate professor of theology at Northern Seminary, and co-host of the Embodied Faith podcast, which offers a neuroscience-informed spiritual formation, which fascinates me. With Cyd Holsclaw, Geoff is the co-author of Does God Really Like Me? Discovering the God Who Wants to Be With You, and the forthcoming Deeply Attached to God. Cyd is an author, spiritual director, and pastor. She's also a trauma-informed, Jesus-centered, integrative coach focused on embodied practices and building a secure attachment to God. Cyd co-hosts the Embodied Faith podcast, offering, again, a neuroscience-informed spiritual formation, and is the co-author of the same book. Geoff and Cyd, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, it's good to be with you.
So great to be with you.
We talked once before, I'll just say it now, and unfortunately our session didn't quite work, so we're here trying again. But I'm doubly looking forward to having this conversation again and nerding out about embodiment and faith and attachment. I love the idea of an embodied faith. And I think so many people who have grown up in church have this dualistic thinking or Gnostic thinking that's backed up often by Paul's writing in Galatians 5. And this idea that the spirit is good and the body is bad. You should keep them separate and deny your flesh and only indulge the spirit and all these sorts of things. Would you share what you mean by an embodied faith and why it's so important?
Yeah, I'll jump in with it, and then I'll do the nerdy stuff, and Cyd will do the practical stuff.
I love
in one
it.
sense. But so the first one would be like the catch-all is embodied, and we could kind of think of it as like a couple different E's because I was raised Baptist, so everything's got to alliterate. So the first one would be like emotional. So we our embodied existence is one where our bodies and our emotions are real, and they're important parts of processing the information of our lives. Then the second one would be embedded, is that we're not just isolated bodies, but our bodies are in connection with other bodies, physically, but also socio-emotionally through the way our faces interact, tone of voice, body posture. And so we're embedded in networks and structures and patterns of relationships, which is two-way, and this is super important. So we're not just isolated individuals who then are going out into the world to make connections. We're always connected all the time. Then another one would be encoded. I could go into this quite a bit, but it's that, it's the idea that all of our information is patterned in some fashion, right? So right now we're exchanging language in English, right? Which is a certain kind of encoding, but even like the way our bodies process those emotions and the way they process our embedded relationships are also encoded in certain ways. And they could be very different from person to person, depending on our life, our trauma, and our other experiences. And then the last one would be extended, is that our embodied lives are extended into the world through cultural artifacts, through right now online, through different devices, and all sorts of things. So I have a computer in front of me. I also have pen and paper. I also have a mug for drinking water, right? So we have all these sorts of things that our cognition kind of is extended, our whole lives are extended through. And then of course our faith is, it's working in and around and through all of those things. So embodied faith is kind of for us a way of saying our whole existence in following Jesus is embodied faith.
Yeah, and I'll just say really simply, I think it's the idea that your body is the only place where you are capable of being. I mean, you cannot be outside of your body. You cannot be in relationship with other people. you can't encounter God anywhere but in your body, because we're humans. It's the only place we can exist. And so when we don't take our bodies into consideration, we're actually missing out on a lot of the way that God communicates with us. I mean, he reveals himself to us on an ongoing, continual basis. And if we ignore our bodies and we ignore how we live in our bodies and move and interact in our bodies, I think we miss the opportunity to experience so much of what God wants us to experience. And so that idea of the body is bad, you should just ignore it or want to flee it or want to escape it someday or beat against it and be against your body, can cause so much anxiety, first of all. And, depression, if you don't like the body you're in. There's a lot of things that can happen with not being at peace in your body. But I think the biggest thing we miss is we don't encounter and experience relationship with God in the fullness that God intends, unless we are actually intentional about being in our bodies.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. So we're embodied, we're embedded in relationships, encoded with all kinds of information, extended out into the world, and that we need to remember how integrated we are, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I've read in a couple other places, and I love the idea that the incarnation was God's biggest endorsement for our embodiment.
Absolutely.
Right? That this spirit that hovered over the waters and did all these things, and this God who's mysterious out there in the unknown chose to become a body. So why should we call ours bad?
Exactly.
I love that. So let's start with anxious and avoidant. I understand these words to be rooted in attachment theory. And Cyd, you have an amazing explanation that I haven't heard anywhere else for this. Would you tell us what that's all about?
Well, I hope you're referring to the idea of jungle, desert, right? Is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
Because when we had this conversation before, I was just thinking, am I going to remember to say the things that we said before? So yeah, it's the idea. If you can imagine, right, that you are in a jungle, and maybe you've been in a jungle, maybe you haven't, but if you can just imagine your stereotypical jungle, like from cartoons or books or whatever. There's a sense in which you never know what's going to happen in the jungle. There's a lot of life. There's a lot of vibrancy. There's a lot of color. There's a lot of noise. There's just something always going on in the jungle. And the way to survive and live well in a jungle is to be paying attention, right? To be able to attend to all of the things going on around you. Because there might be, if something comes out of the bush at you, it might either be something that's trying to devour you, like a panther or a tiger or something like that. Or it might be a beautiful butterfly that you just want to look at. And so it's that sort of sense of always being on guard. And so we use the jungle to describe what is often in the research called an anxious attachment, although anything that's insecure is also going to be anxious. But an anxious attachment in that sense of you're always hyper vigilant, always scanning the emotional and relational environment to make sure that you know and can anticipate what's coming at you, so that you can respond to the cues of people who want to connect with you, and you can guard yourself against the cues of people who don't want to connect with you or who have something against you. And so it's that sense of that hypervigilance of living in the jungle, of always being on guard, always scanning the relational and emotional environment. And it's really something that you can't really turn off. And there's gifts to it. It makes you an incredible people person. You're really good at reading people and relationships and environments, but it also can be exhausting and overwhelming because you can't really ever ignore what someone else might be feeling or experiencing. So that's sort of a description of what in the literature is called an anxious attachment. Then on the flip side of that, you've got the opposite, which is a desert environment. And in a desert environment, there's not a lot of life. And I'm thinking the typical endless sand dunes kind of desert. I know there's a lot of different kinds of deserts, but just picture that sort of endless sand dunes. You see things coming from a long ways away, and you can anticipate things from a long ways away. And there's not much happening. There's not much going on. And so the way to survive in a jungle is to move slowly, to conserve your resources, to sort of keep your resources and your energy to yourself, maybe even having shade or shelter, covering yourself up. And that can very much describe what can be called the avoidant style of attachment, or the an avoidant attachment, because it's that sense of not being hyper aware or even aware at all of the social and relational environment, because you're just not that concerned about it. It didn't do you a lot as a kid to be concerned about it. The people around you didn't seem to attend to your social and emotional needs. And so in many ways, you just kind of shut it down and you go about your life conserving your energy, moving slowly, doing things in a logical and rule following kind of way so that you can survive. And so that would be sort of what's described as the avoidant style. There's more to both of those, but that's like a really simple way to sort of contrast how they feel different. They're both anxious, because there is some anxiety in the desert as well. But it's not presenting anxiety as much as a jungle environment would be presenting anxiety.
Wow. And I think you mentioned last time that the desert was different because where in the jungle you might have easier access to resources, in the desert it really just feels like survival mode.
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah. Like if you think about even just water, right? In the jungle, there's water everywhere. There's water raining from the sky. There's water in streams, rivers, ponds. There's water on leaves that are collecting the water. In the desert, you got to dig very, very deep for water, if there's any at all. So yeah, that sense that like the resources are there and available and you just kind of have so many coming at you and you got to choose which ones. But in the desert, it's just, you're sort of on your own.
Yeah. I have a lot more questions, but before we keep going, I'm realizing now that some people may have no idea what we're talking about when we talk about attachment.
Yeah, good point.
Let's set the table. What is attachment?
Geoff, you want to take a first shot
sure.
there?
So attachment, or attachment theory or attachment science is this understanding of childhood development as well as, and it kind of follows us into our adult lives, that the core relationships in our childhood, the people that we attach to from a very young age, starts right when you're born, but really kind of, starts functioning in a kind of a very observational way about 9 months, is you become attached to your caregivers, and you start having interactive relationships with your caregivers well before you're even speaking. And so there's all different kind of ways of eye connections and playing games and making sounds and crying when you're distressed. And the child will then begin to form an understanding of how the world works, what their place in the world is, what they can expect from the world generally, but then specifically what they can expect from other people. And so you start getting these categories of the self, others, and the world kind of getting ingrained. And this is all pre-verbal information or processing. This is kind of how your nervous system gets built. And so in certain child caring environments where the caregivers are very disconnected, especially socially and emotionally, maybe they care for your most basic physical needs, but they're very rule oriented. They don't respond to outbursts and high emotions. They tell you to stop feeling those feelings. Let's just follow the rules. These are the checklists. This is the bedtime routine. How you feel about this situation is irrelevant. It's called a dismissing environment. And so if you're raised in a dismissing environment, it's not that you choose to start ignoring emotional information. It's just that your body grows up for all the way from 9 months or earlier. It starts growing up to ignore. That information does me no good, because when I send out emotional signals to the world, I don't get anything back. I get frustrated and angry. I can't spend my whole life frustrated and angry. Again, this is a pre-verbal baby, right? So I'm just going to stop doing that. I'm going to figure out different ways. And kids are brilliant. So children are brilliant. They're going to figure out the ways to survive and get what they need. And so that would be like a dismissing environment, which then grows into what we call the desert, where giving and receiving social and emotional information is not a part of your regular makeup. You follow the rules, you find the patterns, and you keep your distance from people. But you can have a different kind of childhood environment where your attachment style or what we would call attachment strategy is to be hyper vigilant. Sometimes my caregiver is around and is really engaged with me around my needs, and sometimes they're not. And I have to pay very close attention to all the signals they're getting out so that I can know how to like move in or how to get their attention or how do I get that extra cookie for dinner? Are they in a good mood? Can I kind of weasel my way to get the cookie, or are they in a bad mood? I shouldn't ask, otherwise things will just get worse. Right. So you're hyper vigilant, but there's no real patterns because the caregiving is inconsistent. So the only pattern is that I have to pay attention. And so this grows into, your early childhood and your adult life. It grows into what we call the jungle. What Cyd was talking about, the jungle. There's no real patterns or rules. I could find the most amazing waterfall around this quarter, or something could kill me. I don't know until I get there. And it could change on me immediately. The thing that I thought was beautiful is actually poisonous or something. Right. And so you learn to kind of really, but you still want the relationship. If you're in the desert, most of your heart is kind of closed off to deep relationships to yourself. You become very unknown even to yourself. And then you're not seeking intimacy with others. But the jungle person really is still seeking that, and they're kind of driven to it. It's kind of like a chronic anxiety. This is why it's called anxious. And then there is also secure attachment, where you're from early childhood, your caregiver is attentive and attuned, is often the language, to help you when you need help, but also to actually give you independence. This is a key factor for childhood is my caregiver giving me enough independence that I can grow in my capacities and capabilities. And so the attuned caregiver will give opportunities for independence, but then will help out when you're starting to fail or become overwhelmed or frustrated. And they find that balance, and you grow up into what is called a secure attachment, which is neither of the extremes of the desert, where you can function on your own when needed, but when you're overwhelmed and kind of breaking down, you can ask for help and kind of manage those two kind of poles.
Thank you. That's
So I'll try to say super simple again. Attachment. When we talk about attachment, if you think about the way that, like maybe like two sides of Velcro, right? Where you put like, when you hang something on the wall, you've got like the more plasticky side, and then you've got like the fuzzy side, right? And so when they're pressed together, they're attached, right? But even when they're separated from each other, they're still both ready for that attachment, right? Because you still have the piece here and the piece here. So even if you take that piece, that poster or whatever it is that you're going to hang on a wall, and you bring it over to somewhere else where there's also a sticky thing, you can stick it there as well, because they're interchangeable. But it's that point of like, you are prepared to be able to have relationship. Right. So that early childhood development attachment relationship is not just about the relationship between the early caregiver and the child, but it's preparing that child to be attachable or relatable for the rest of their life. And so that attachment shapes and forms your nervous system. It shapes and forms your implicit beliefs about the world. And it shapes and forms your defaults about how you're going to engage with other people and how you're going to engage with yourself. So I kind of like that idea of the attachment being like, it's that sort of like the sticky thing on your back that's always ready to get stuck in a good way.
Yeah. That's helpful. I think, I can imagine it being really easy to hear this conversation and think, okay, great. I was messed up as a child and now there's no hope. Right?
Well, I would say that most of us were. So,
yes. Yes. And recognizing that we're still built to attach to something or somebody as adults, as adolescents, as whatever, and that the potential sort of is always out there if we're ready to receive it, right? So you mentioned an anxious jungle, an avoidant desert. Secure, I think we talked about before, as the pasture.
Yeah. When we talked to you last time, we talked about how secure attachment very much looks like the relationship between a sheep and a shepherd, right? So if you look at Psalm 23, which is a very familiar psalm for most of us, it's that idea of like, the Lord is my shepherd. There is nothing that I am in want for, because he has provided everything. He's with me in the dark places. He's leading me. We're, dwelling in goodness and mercy in the house of the Lord forever. So it's that trusting, providing relationship of I can trust in the shepherd, and the shepherd cares about me. He knows me by name. He's tends to me and knows my needs.
It sounds lovely.
Yeah.
And then I imagine for a lot of people who are attending the summit, watching or listening to this, most likely they've experienced some kind of spiritual abuse or carry some kind of religious trauma with them. they've been harmed by authorities or leaders or other people in the church. And this last one that you described, this disorganized attachment that you call the war zone, could you tell us about that one?
Yeah, so that's that, and that is so there's like reactive attachment if you've read any literature about it, but it's this sense of you never know what to expect from the relationships that are most significant to you. So in the, Geoff talked about like in the jungle, there's a little bit of unpredictability because things don't necessarily follow rules and patterns. But for the most part, your caregiver is, decently predisposed toward you in the sense that like, they're generally, not going to be super abusive or harmful to you. They just might neglect certain things at certain times.
Okay.
But in a war zone, it's more like there's active abuse coming from the same person who you're looking to for affection or love or security.
Right.
And so that same person that you're depending on and seeking for relationship is the same person who is actively hurting you or abusing you. And so that's where that war zone analogy of, there are bombs dropping from the sky and you never know. And you just have to run and take shelter. And, you might, and there might be landmines from below. So you just don't know. There doesn't seem to be anywhere that is really safe. And so that describes that sort of war zone, and that there are not really any relationships that you truly trust because you have that sort of shaping of the same person that I'm looking to for love and care is the same person who hurts me. So I simultaneously move toward and away from the same person because there's this draw toward and a fear.
Yeah.
And I think, and Brian, you mentioned, this summit is about like church abuse and trauma. And so some people will, heard the descriptions of, the different landscapes and were like, well, I might very well have been raised in a securely attached environment. But what can happen is that adulthood trauma or adolescent trauma or abuse of different kinds or severe relational abuse as an adult in a marriage or something like that can then, push you right out of that secure attachment. Usually we think, we want to move from insecure attachment into secure attachment. And that is the goal, right? But the reverse reality is tragically true, is that, you could have been up to say, 23, a fairly well-adjusted, securely attached person who was open to, living with God and, serving your community. And then all of a sudden, bam. And now you find yourself in more of a desert person. You've walled off your heart. I'm never going to let that happen again. Or jungle person where it's like, I am always watching to make sure that doesn't happen again, or, you could be like in the war zone. And so you can kind of, unfortunately get knocked by abuse and trauma into those other kind of landscapes.
Yeah. That's good to hear too, that you're not stuck or condemned to one landscape for any period of time, that you can kind of move between them. I hear a lot of similarities to polyvagal language, to IFS language, that there's, whether we're moving up that polyvagal ladder from dorsal to vagal and from feeling safe, secure, connected, regulated to being completely dysregulated and shut down, or whether it's the IFS models of this idea. You said something earlier, Cyd, this idea that even the jungle or the desert, having this anxious or avoidant attachment can sometimes be a gift. And this idea that our parts of us, even though they seem harmful or they don't bring out the best behavior in us, they're actually trying to protect us and to help us survive because that's the environment we grew up in. So I think that the first question that comes up is this idea is like, for people who have an anxious, avoidant, or even disorganized attachment, jungle, desert, or war zone, can we find our way to the pasture? Is it even possible?
Yes, unequivocally, yes.
Great.
Yes, the answer is yes. And I think that's a really good point that you made in bringing it to like IFS, because I think, so just to be like technical and nerdy, right? So the language says like those would be secondary strategies. Like our primary strategy is to connect, is to have a secure attachment, is to go to people when we're overwhelmed. And in a sense, in a positive way, to expect them to help. I have faith that people will help me. I have some sort of hope that, even though this stinks right now, that things will get better. And that, I have some gift or agency that I can live out of. and offer this situation, right? So that would be like the characteristics of someone who's securely attached. But the secondary strategies, they don't lose all of that. It doesn't mean you have none of that. It just means you kind of had to modulate. And so in IFS language is you have like protectors and managers. So I have, you know, for me, I developed more desert managers. I'm going to, be a high achiever. I'm going to be known for my accomplishments. And now I'm going to protect my image in front of, peers, and I'm in a competition with people, right? And Cyd could, outline her more desert kind of protectors and managers.
My jungle,
or jungle, right? And so I think that those things definitely fit together, like you were saying.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. And all those secondary mechanisms or strategies that he was talking about, like you said, you developed them because they worked. Mm-hmm. Right. And they became your go-to tools because they actually did get you through what you needed to get through. They did help you survive what you needed to survive. And when you are securely attached, so the gifts or the strategies that are used in the jungle and used in the desert, they're actually all available in the pasture. So all of those things are accessible in the pasture. Right. So just as a sort of quick example, like even as you've been listening to this session, for anybody who's watching the summit, some of you have been really noticing my eyes and my facial expression, and noticing that Geoff doesn't always look at the camera or doesn't even look at the screen, because Geoff's focus is on the words. It's the content.
Look at all the books I have displayed behind me, all the words encased in books.
That's right. So when he's having conversations with people, he's listening to the words. He's listening to the content. When I'm having conversations with people, I'm watching the face. I'm listening to the tone. I'm looking at eyes. And so when Geoff and I are together in the same room, just a minute, when we're together in the same room, listening to the same person, we might be picking up on different things, but that information is valuable to getting a clear and whole picture to what is actually being communicated, right? And so my gift and strength is that I am noticing the nonverbal cues, that stuff that's sort of the implied, how a person is expressing themselves. And Geoff is hearing the verbal cues. But when those things come together, we have a fuller understanding of what's going on. Right. So the jungle person is going to have more access to those nonverbal cues. The desert person is going to have more access to those verbal, the content. But in the pasture, you have both.
Right. And just like a really nerdy detail is people who are in the desert or who have a more avoidant attachment, they'll actually look at people's mouths instead of their whole face. And then people in the jungle with the anxious attachment will look at their eyes. So, and that is kind of like the difference between the nonverbal eye, looking at the eyes for information, and the verbal looking at the mouth. So those, but both, like Cyd said, those are both gifts. They become problems when you only emphasize that. So early in our marriage, I would be like defining and parsing words and what actually happened and what was actually said. And she's like,
not paying any attention to how I was feeling or the sound.
And Cyd's like, your body was so loud and angry at me, I had no idea what you were actually saying, and I'm just like, well, ignore all that. That's irrelevant information. Right. And so the goal isn't to say like, well, one is right and the other is wrong. The goal is to say, well, we're unintegrated in our processing of relational cognitive information, and both of us need to be integrated. We get into problems when we view our perspective as our lopsided perspective as the only true and correct perspective, and then Cyd's seeing her perspective as the only true, and then we judge and this is early marriage for us for sure.
Yeah, but I love that. And I remember talking about this last time too, this idea of this integrated approach, which Todd Wilson talks about in his book, Enneagram Goes to Church, and this idea of just because we have completely different ways of perceiving the world or receiving and processing information doesn't make one of us wrong and the other one right. It's just different. And when we come to appreciate those differences and recognize what we're trying to bring to the table or how we're trying to communicate or whatever those things are, then we get much farther in our attachment or in our relationships or any of those things. And I talked about that old show, Lie to Me, which wasn't on for very long, but I loved it. And it was this idea of reading micro expressions in people, like the teeniest shrug of a shoulder or the raise of the eyebrows, and reading that kind of detail, whether it's in the eyes or in the mouth, whether it's hearing the cognitive words versus reading someone's body language. And this idea that we can pick up on that level of stuff intuitively,
right?
And then either read or completely misread a situation based on our attachment or based on our polyvagal level or where we are and how attached or regulated or dysregulated we are. It's
Yes.
just
Yep.
wild how much variety there is out there, right? So
Exactly.
for someone who is anxious or avoidant, how do we start to move toward that pasture?
That's a great question.
Yeah, it's going to vary depending on where you start, right? So if you're starting in the jungle, your pathway is going to look a little different than if you're starting in the desert.
A lot different.
A lot different. Yeah, I say a little, but it's actually a lot different. But the one thing that they all have in common, no matter where you find yourself, the first step toward the pasture is going to be to build joy. And joy in the sense of not like I'm happy because of my circumstances. And especially a lot of people who are listening, have had difficult circumstances and have suffered. And so it's not just, oh, put on a happy face and pretend it never happened. It's the recognition that you need to be finding people, and primarily God, who is glad to be with you, no matter what state you're in, no matter how you're feeling, no matter what you're experiencing, no matter what you're thinking, right? And that's why we wrote our book, Does God Really Like Me? Because the whole story of the Bible is God wanting to be with his people all the time, regardless of what kind of shape they're in and regardless of what they're up to. And so that's the first step toward the pasture, is building relationships that are full of joy, where someone else is glad to be with you. So finding people in your life who can express gladness to be with you, you expressing gladness to be with other people, really building that connection and finding that connection with God, which I know is difficult to do, especially with church abuse, because the layering of the faith and all the things people have said to you about God and used God's name in ways that have been hurtful, it's hard to really disentangle a lot of that. Which is another thing we tried to do in our book, was to try to disentangle all of the like really cultural things about this is who God is and this is how we are to behave as Christians, but to really get to God as the Father, the perfect Father, who does want to care for you as a father is intended and supposed to care for you, not in all the ways that, fathers don't care or abuse or neglect. And then also that intimacy with Jesus, where we are brought into the family through the person of Jesus and living his life with him, experiencing the belovedness that Jesus experienced. And I won't keep going, but that's the first step to getting into the pasture, is really building joy, because joy is so central to our identity. It shapes and forms how we think of ourselves and what we expect in our relationships with other people. And so when there's low joy in your life, there's going to be low anything else. Yeah. And as your capacity for joy increases, you also are able to have greater capacity for difficult or strong emotions that don't feel as good.
And to link that to the polyvagal stuff that you were bringing up earlier, Brian, the practicing of joy, and sometimes joy can seem so like lofty, right? So we could bring it down to like gratitude, thankfulness, or just grounding in the present moment, whether it's just pressing your feet in the ground and saying, I am safe. And so it connects to the polyvagal stuff, because it's really just in the presence of other people, climbing that, that ladder out of protection modes into connection mode. And the science shows, and interesting scripture backs this up in the Psalms, that gratitude, thankfulness, and joy is kind of those threshold things, telling your body that I am safe in this moment. I have the resources I need in this moment. And now I can remember past moments too, where I have, God's provided for me for this. And I have these 3 friendships that I really value. And even though I'm not with them now, I remember that I have them. And, I'm not too cold because I'm indoors, even though it's a Michigan winter, right? So wherever you need to start, you can kind of enter in that place. And so that's, connects to that polyvagal stuff too.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And I think, first of all, we have Heather Gargis is a somatic practitioner. And she talks a lot about those really small grounding exercises that you can do with your body to just say, okay, I'm here, I'm present, I'm not wherever my trauma is taking me back to. And there's this idea of for people who may have experienced that war zone, where joy does feel way too lofty because they're too busy building a bomb shelter to hide under,
Right.
or running to one that they've already constructed for themselves. Just the idea of learning to be present again, or to figure out something small to be grateful for, that there isn't a bomb dropping right now, or that I've had a few moments of peace, even while being anxious about the next one coming, is still a step toward that pasture. So if you've experienced that war zone, if you've experienced the jungle or the desert, it's not a conviction or condemnation to stay there for the rest of your life, that there are steps that you can take toward that pasture again. And I think that is just so hopeful.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it
And they
is.
connected to some of the other literature just for students or practitioners who kind of have other training, like Deb Dana. She talks about glimmers. And so that's basically, rather than having triggers that send us down the polyvagal kind of system, we have glimmers. And really, that's just gratitude. When I listen to her talk, I'm just like, that's what the Bible, is speaking about for gratitude and thanksgiving. We enter God's courts with thanksgiving and praise. So yeah, I just want to connect some of those dots there.
Yeah, no, thank you. I love that.
Well, and the other thing too is that building joy and like the desire to change, right? The movement. We all know, I mean, I'm sure you're talking lots about neuroplasticity and rewiring the brain and neural connections and all that kind of thing. But I think it's also really important to stay in touch with a vision of what can be, right? Because that's one of the hardest things after you've experienced what church, how ugly it can be or how painful it can be, to try to do that dangerous work of what would it look like to actually hope in something, and what is the smallest way I can begin to hope, and then setting your focus there, rather than in the focus of what has happened, but in the what can be, and that sort of moving toward the compelling vision, knowing it may not happen in this lifetime, but it doesn't make it impossible. And that's probably a whole can of worms right there. But just that sense
It
of
is.
like, it's when we have something compelling to move toward that we have the
Yeah.
desire and the motivation to actually do the work that it takes to rewire our brains.
Yeah, thank you. And I think to reference two of our other sessions, Wade Mullen writes the book Something's Not Right, which kind of gives you language to recognize what happened to you in the first place if you've experienced some kind of abuse in the church, and just to be able to name it. And then Laura Barringer and Scott McKnight wrote A Church Called Tove and Pivot, which to me provides that dream and hope for what could be. It's like the church is this way and this has happened, but it could be or should be like this. And I think having that vision does really help you propel you forward or pull you out of the muck that you feel stuck in. And I think that can be really, really helpful in taking those steps toward joy, like you're talking about. You mentioned the neuroplasticity and those stuff. So let's move to that part. Can we talk about your DMIN program for spiritual formation and relational neuroscience, right? So first of all, what is relational neuroscience? And I think we talked before about Kurt Thompson's work in interpersonal neurobiology. Is it similar? Is it same? Is it different?
Yeah, if people know like Kurt Thompson's work, and that really was based on someone named Dan Siegel, who was a pioneer in the field of interpersonal neurobiology, as well as Alan Shore and other people, and Pat Ogden, as far as like the trauma stream goes. She's like right in this interpersonal neurobiology stream from the somatic side. And so just throwing out all those names. But when I was talking about, well, what is embodied faith, I was using those 4 E's are really just kind of like my understanding of the interpersonal neurobiology. So we're taking our bodies and our emotions seriously, our embedded relationships. How do we encode or process kind of the information of our lives? And that information is in our bodies, but also between us as people. And then how does that get extended out into the world? And so the hope for us and for this DMIN is really to kind of bring this exact conversation that we're having right now about attachment, church life, and then spiritual formation. We haven't called it that, but that's kind of what at least Cyd and I are understanding what we're doing, right? Is we're wanting to bring this whole kind of conversation before pastors and other ministry leaders, as well as therapists who are actually interested in the program, so that they can kind of have this integrated kind of vision of how God and God's people can be this place of neuroplasticity, if we want to say it, that of journeying toward secure attachment. And so we see attachment theory, attachment science as kind of this great interface between the scientific side of all the things we've been talking about, the neuroscience, the polyvagal, IFS stuff. But then, and that has to do with the relationships you're in. But then the spiritual formation is also in different ways talked about those same things. How are we attaching to God, becoming detached from the things of this world? How are we shaped and formed in our liturgy and our prayers and silence and solitude? What are the pathways in which this happens? And so we're trying to bring all these things together. We're really excited. A lot of really neat, interesting people are already kind of involved in it. And so we're just kind of, as pastors and theologians and spiritual director and coach, we're trying to, bring this to the church more.
Yeah. And one of the things I think is so exciting is just bringing people from different fields together to have conversation together about all of this. And just, Geoff and I both have a deep love for the church, and just really believe that, the church really, a church called Tove, right? Like a beautiful church. And so just really wanting to gather people who also want to contribute and create resources and do projects that are going to further this beautiful vision of church together.
Yeah, I love that. And I think the idea of neuroplasticity, for people who may not be familiar with that, just the idea that you can actually teach an old dog new tricks.
Right. But only generally in community with other people.
Right.
Right.
That's
you
really
can't
good.
do it by yourself. So the whole trick is you didn't get into the mess that you're in by yourself, and you're not getting out of it by yourself.
Yeah.
Right. Like the trauma that, and abuse that we live with and carry, like that wasn't just because you were sitting in a room by yourself. Like tragically, it's because of other broken people. And sometimes at the beginning, maybe you just need to be by yourself and separate, right? But we know that only true deep healing and change comes, you have to find another healthy, thriving community to be a part of, right? And so, we have to be communities that are like that. And then, our hope, this is the name of this talk, is that, through those processes of becoming more securely attached, like it'll quiet those anxious places, those anxious managers, it'll quiet those avoidant protectors, so that we can competently, love God and love others, as Jesus, commanded us, especially as well as to love our neighbors and our enemies, which can be a very dysregulating process, right? So how can we build even into that far-reaching goal of, loving our enemies, even those, and this is not like happens overnight, right? So anyways.
That's super helpful. Thank you. And it will be good for people to know that you guys are actually our very first continued conversation coming up in February. I think from the date of the summit, it'll be 2 weeks after the summit. We'll be together again live on a Zoom call. So for people who are curious to know more about this, ask Geoff and Cyd all the questions in the world about all of these things, or it could just be the three of us nerding out together. And I would also love that. But
Perfect.
You're invited to that continued conversation in February to have that conversation with us. Is there anything we haven't mentioned that you'd like to share? Because we've covered a lot and I've loved all of it.
So I just want to put, and maybe this will start a whole nother conversation. But the idea of like, there's two moments kind of in our healing journey as we move from insecurely attached to securely attached. And that would be, and so there's like recent literature that talks about this, that we first need to buffer, this is not my language, but to buffer the insecurity. And so as pastors or therapists or just caring loved ones, like how can we meet the person that's in the jungle or in the desert or in the war zone and help buffer that insecurity, help them feel safe and seen and heard and understood. And that's the first one. And I think generally in these conversations that happens like really well, spontaneously. But then the second one is actually, well, how do we build toward that insecurity? And it's usually doing the opposite thing than we intuit. And so someone in the jungle is looking to be affirmed in their personhood and their sense of belonging, and that needs to be bolstered, right? So that'd be buffering the insecurity. But part of building the security long-term would be to rediscover their agency, right? And I know a lot of people kind of take that pathway. Like I've learned to say no, right? So that's to draw a boundary and to keep it is an action of agency, and they kind of move that way. And so, but for someone like in the desert, that process is reversed. So I was, a more deserty person, right? So how does someone buffer my insecurity? It's not to tell me that I'm beloved and belonged and that nothing I do can change that. Why? Because my heart's been turned off to that message already. And so I'm just kind of like, whatever, everybody says that. I don't know. I don't care. Right. But to say things to someone like me, who's really good at following the rules and finds their identity in what they do, it is to affirm and say, you know what, you do that really well. Like you put a lot of effort into that. I want to see and honor how you serve those other people or how you did X, Y, and Z. And so instead of disaffirming, like, don't be who you are through your activities, just like be who you are, in your being or something like that. That doesn't buffer my insecurity. That buffers a jungle person's insecurity. It doesn't help my insecurity, right? So affirming the activities, but then long term, the building is for me to learn how to be vulnerable. It is to learn how to connect to my emotions. It is learn how to just be outside of my accomplishments, right? And so those pathways that people are on from the jungle and desert and the war zone are different. And I think sometimes there's different like churches or therapeutic models that'll kind of just do one or the other, right? So we get a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy. Just think your way out of the situation. Oh, desert people love that for a little while, right? Kind of reaffirms all the things they're good at. But long term, that's not actually like building, and then some people who are in jungle, it's like a very caring and nurturing environment, but then the CBD stuff, they're, it's like, well, that might do them some good long term, right? So anyways, I just wanted to kind of throw that two-step out that I think some of the current attachment research is showing that you kind of need in your relationships, kind of those two things. How do I buffer the insecurity of a person, either in myself or the person I'm with, but then in appropriate and trusting ways, how can I either challenge myself into that new step to build the security, or how am I drawing or inviting other people in appropriate ways? And it'll look different for different people.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah,
Cyd,
and I
anything
just
from
get
you?
yeah, I think I just want to say, like, I am really excited about the idea of a church where people don't have to be ashamed of their attachment, and don't have to carry it like it's something shameful and they have to hide, but instead a place where people can openly say, this happens to be the story I'm coming with, and this happens to be what I'm shaped. And so I'm aware that I am especially drawn to relationship, and I really need to be affirmed and valued in my, I feel like if you don't recognize my emotions, you're not recognizing me as a human. And just to be able to say that and articulate that to someone else who's saying, and I don't really even know what emotions are, and I recognize I need to learn what those are. And so I'm going to have a really hard time meeting you in your emotions, but I'd sure like to learn from you about emotions, right? And here's what I can offer to you. And I just think if we could have a community like that someday, right? And where pastors could understand, here's how I need to buffer this person's insecurity, and here's how I can build them. And then also, having people come to church recognizing this is what I'm looking for when I come to a church and you're not delivering it. That doesn't necessarily mean it's you. It could also be me. And can we have a conversation about what we're after here and what God intends for all of us? Because we've got wounded and weary and burnt out leaders, and we've got hurt and, isolated people. And how do we all come together in a place where we can all be moving toward the pasture together? And I think the church is the place where that should be happening. And we just long to be part of building communities that are doing that.
May it be so.
Amen.
Thank you for sharing that.
Well, thank you for all your work in bringing attention and resources and opportunity around all this, Brian.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. We'll provide links for all the stuff that we talked about, including a lot of the books that we reference. Where else can people find you guys online?
I'm very findable, Geoff Holsclaw on Facebook. So if you want to keep up with my regular thoughts on these themes, then grassrootschristianity.org is a great way to find us. Our kind of joint website is embodiedfaith.life. That's where you can find some of the cohorts we're offering, as well as our podcast. And then, Cyd, where can people find you?
Yeah, you can find me at cydholsclaw.com. I'm not big in social media because I like to be interacting with people. I don't like the content out in the world. So I am on Facebook. I think I'm still on Instagram. I'm not even sure. But cydholsclaw.com is my website, and there's a little link up there, a little tab that says Let's Talk. And so if you're curious or want to have a conversation with me, that's a good place to find me.
Awesome. Geoff and Cyd, thanks so much again for participating again in the summit and helping others move toward healing and wholeness.
It's our pleasure.
I continue to be fascinated by attachment theory and love the way that Geoff and Cyd approach it. You can find all the links in the show notes. And don't forget, you can still get 30% off an all-access pass from any of our annual summits. You may have heard on previous episodes that the discount expires at the end of June. Well, I realize that many of us listen to episodes a bit later or on a delay, and I get it. I do the same thing. So, we're extending the sale through the end of August 2025. Use code PODCAST30, that's PODCAST30, to take advantage of this offer today. Subscribe or follow the show to get new episodes automatically. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating and review or share with your friends. We need your support to make this podcast possible. Click on the link in the show notes to make a donation today. Thanks again for taking the time out of your day to listen. I hope it's been helpful. Here's to moving toward healing and wholeness together. I'll see you next time.